All right, so this is HS 51 or 3153, and this is Abnormal Psychology, chapters 2 and 3. I do have a couple of students with me, so they may ask questions as we go along. Uh, we'll just dive right in. This is going to be perspectives on abnormal psychology, so looking at different models and some additional features in this chapter. So the model explains the cause of the mental disorder, the assessment of the mental disorder, and the prevention and treatment of mental disorders. And we have 5 different perspectives on how a model does that. So we have the biological model, which looks at things like genetics and their influence on mental health. We have a genotype, which is what produces the characteristics such as eye color, things that don't change over time. And then we have the phenotype, which is actually what we observe, um, observable characteristics of a person that can change over time. Obviously, um, may not be able to see it because my hair is pulled back, but my hair used to be dark brown and now it's turning gray. And so even though my genotype is dark brown hair, my phenotype is now gray, and it's going that direction. So that's one way that looks the genotype and the phenotype. Well, the phenotype will change over time, even though my genotype doesn't. Um, Looking at genetic heritability, as you can see, schizophrenia, there's a strong genetic connection there, as well as bipolar disorder is a strong genetic. Substance use disorder is also a fairly strong genetic heritability, while major depression and anxiety are low compared to those, but still relatively high at 30%. So there's a 1/3 chance of getting major depression if you have a parent or somebody who has any of these type of disorders. This chapter does go over the nervous systems and neurons. If you've already taken the quiz, then you realize that I did not ask any questions about any of the nervous system. So uh, just quickly go over, um, we have the cell body, the nucleus. Over here we have the dendrites, the axon. This little sheath here is the myelin sheath, and that's what helps make the impulses go quicker. And then we have the terminal buttons, which is where these connect to the dendrites of the next cell body, of the next cell, and that's where we get the neurotransmitters that go in between. They don't actually physically touch, they just release neurotransmitter to make the connection. We have the different types of neurotransmitters, serotonin, which is responsible for the processing of information, mood regulation, behavior, and thought process, norepinephrine, regulation of arousal, mood, behavior, and sleep, dopamine, which influences novelty seeking, sociability, pleasure, motivation, coordination, and motor movement. Dopamine's one of the key components of addiction and the addiction process. Gamma, we'll just go with GABA, and regulation of mood, especially anxiety, arousal, behavior. Acetylcholine, important in motor behavior, arousal, reward, attention, learning, and behavior. And glutamate. These neurotransmitters, and there are other ones, of course, but these are some of the main ones that are significant to um, mental health. Glutamate influences learning and memory, and is also one of the neurotransmitters that's really a big part of addiction. So, serotonin, of course, is often related to depression, and norepinephrine and GABA are related to anxiety issues. So, again, we're not really going to go over all the different aspects of the brain, but um, as you can see, we have the different, the frontal lobe, which is what separates us from most other animals. And this is where doesn't even get fully developed until 25, 26 years old. And then the other aspects here, the parietal lobe is often where the motor functions are, occipital lobe related to the eyes. Um, Language is often over here, located over here, Wernicke's area, etc. So Broca's area and uh, the brain. The limbic system, which is responsible for fight, flight responses, etc. Amygdala, hippocampus for memory. The amygdala is key for people like with anger. Uh, Often people with a lot of anger problems have a bigger amygdala. They really process a lot of anger, uh, things like that. Cerebellum, the small brain. So overall, the biological model assumes that mental states, emotions, and behaviors arise largely out of the physical processes of the brain. The biological model is important for understanding many components of major mental disorders, but it cannot explain all aspects of the disorders. So there's something that often is going on, which is just beyond the biological model. Um, it's not like we think we have a mind that just operates from the physical presence. There's a lot of things that are going on beyond just the physical aspects of the thinking of the mind. So we go from one based totally on physical stuff to the psychodynamic model, Sigmund Freud. And there are other people who are also psychodynamic and don't necessarily believe everything that Freud said. Alfred Adler is another person who falls under psychodynamic. So uh, Freud is probably one of the most popular, and even in regular, I mean, everything from Big Bang Theory to other stuff. Talk about the television show, still is in our culture and has a lot of stuff. We talk about anal people who are anal. That comes from this work of psychodynamic. So we have the super ego, the id. The super ego is like the law, has all the morality, is very black and white on what's good, what's bad. The ego is kind of in the middle between the id and the super ego. And the id is just looking for pleasure. It really wants, it's kind of going in between the law and just wanting to feel good. So a lot of this is where the problems come out from the psychodynamic model. The different stages of development, according to Freud, we have the oral, the anal, the phallic latency period, and then the genital. And so each of these contributes to the overall model. We have our defense mechanisms. And usually this is one of the things that if you learn from anything about psychology, these are still relevant. We still have a lot of these defense mechanisms. People still use them. And this is kind of the difference between the physical, the biological model, is that there's nowhere that you can say physically in the brain is a defense mechanism. And so there's something that is going on in the brain that's beyond the physical presence, but there's a mental thing going on. Of course, everybody is familiar with the Rorschach. Looking at this, what do you see? And some of the strengths is it helps focus on preventing or providing better environments for children, and the defense mechanisms is intuitive. It's easy to look at repression and projection and all the different types of defense mechanisms that were listed in the book. Some of the limitations are, of course, a lack of research. Even after all this time, there's a lack of research in the psychodynamic approach. Um, it's abstract and sometimes difficult to measure. Some of the terms don't really seem grounded in some ideas. So I myself am actually a psychodynamic. I'm more of a Alfred Adler psychodynamic therapist, and I believe basically just that early childhood experiences make a big impact in later on life development. So that's another way to kind of look at the psychodynamic approach. The humanistic model, we have Carl Rogers, Maslow, Rollo May. These individuals all are about the humanistic model. And this, of course, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So once our basic needs are being met, the physiological, the next level up is looking for safety and security, physical safety, economic, etc. Then we start to expand and grow into social belonging, acceptance, being a part of a group, identifying with a successful team. Then we have individual ego, esteem, working on like getting a degree, things like that. And then ultimately, the goal is self-actualization, challenging projects, opportunities for innovation and creativity, learning and creating at a high level. And often at the self-actualization level, you're really no longer doing things for your own esteem, but you're really looking at making an impact in society. So, if you're going to go on to become a therapist or a counselor, then that can be a self-actualizing job. You're giving up your time and working with others to help them improve their lives, which kind of goes along with this model and that idea of self-actualization. And some of us might even carry it to the point where we decide to do social justice and really attack some of the um, social mechanisms that prevent people from growing. So often it's a qualitative assessment and it's non-directive, humanistic, whereas biological, the therapist is often in direct control. Psychodynamic, it's often being led by the therapist. Humanistic is actually being led by the client. And so we spend a lot of time finding out why the client's there, what maybe their ideal world or their model for the world is, and why they're not meeting that model, where there is a separation between what they want and where they're at, and helping them come to the realization of getting to where they're at in a way. The strengths are it focuses on human choice and growth and emphasizes the client responsibility and recovery. The limitations unscientific, largely lacking empirical support, and less applicability to people with severe mental disorders. Um, this is more where counseling fits in. Not that we can't work with people with more severe mental disorders, but uh, Rogers actually did. There's quite a bit of research done on the therapeutic relationship, which is what Rogers was basically talking about. So there is some evidence for the therapeutic relationship and how effective that is, but the theory as a whole has not had a whole lot of research. Cognitive behavioral, this model has lots of research, and that's one of the reasons why they use it often in schools and other situations. Basically, we're looking at classical conditioning, so an unconditioned stimulus response, or conditioned stimulus and then a conditioned stimulus. You pair those together so that the response happens. This is where we get to look at positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is adding stuff. So the behavior, obviously here we have the child is vacuuming, cleaning up the house, keeping her room clean, and she's getting paid. So she's receiving something, money, and she's being rewarded. And so she's more likely to repeat that behavior because she likes the reward. Sean flies on an airplane but has a virus, so he gets sick. And so the next time he gets on an airplane or avoids getting on an airplane altogether because he's afraid that the airplane is what caused his condition instead of necessarily the virus. And so instead of flying, he takes the bus. But if you've ever ridden a bus across the country, you realize you're probably better off taking the airplane. You don't have to worry about so many things, but I've taken a trip across from California to Ohio when I was in the Marine Corps, and that was 5 days of my life that I could never get back. Cognitive behavioral therapy, our assessment and treatment. The treatments, obviously CBT, changing how a person thinks and behaves, rational restructuring, for like phobias, systematic sensitization, exposure, token economies. All these treatments come out of the cognitive behavioral. Like I said, arachnophobia, getting a client to where they could actually be touched by a spider. The sociocultural model, the book obviously talks about how our culture creates, for instance, the disorder of anorexia or bulimia, how we have a lot of food available within our culture, and out of that excess, we get individuals who react to that through things like anorexia or bulimia. Sociocultural factors include culture, gender, where you live at, neighborhoods, communities, etc., and then of course your own family structure. And one of the things that's included in sociocultural factors is the family systems approach. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. How do cultures influence the development of mental health issues? What aspects of neighborhoods, communities, and families are associated with stress and mental health? And what are the strengths and limitations of the sociocultural perspective? And a lot of times when we talk about sociocultural perspective, we talk about things like social justice and how living, of course, in an urban area influences the mental health of the individuals who live there. And of course, those people who live in those urban areas tend to be people of color. And so hence that's where social justice comes in. So there's lots of processes that are regarding the treatment of individuals. Narrative therapy is one of those things that really helps with the sociocultural perspective by giving a person a voice and allowing them to break down those rules and regulations of the society that keep them either down or separate from what they could become. And so that's one perspective. Anybody have any questions on the different perspectives of mental health, the different models? No? All right. So chapter 3, risk and prevention of mental disorders. We're going to talk about the diathesis stress model, epidemiology, risk and protective factors, and resilience. That's my field of study, and prevention. So diathesis is a biological or physical psychological predisposition to a disorder, a vulnerability to a disorder, and it's produced by a combination of a predisposition and stress. And so a person may have a predisposition, but if the stressor never occurs that would get them to have that come about, then they won't get it. it's an interesting perspective on how people become, for instance, addicted to alcohol or drugs. And so, um, when there's a predisposition to impulsivity is present, there's different levels of alcohol abuse. And as there's low stress, there's very small chance of becoming addicted or having abusing alcohol. And the greater the impulse is to being absent all the way through high, medium, and low, the greater the impact or the probability of an individual becoming and developing such a thing as alcohol abuse. So one of the things that the ethicist stress model does for us is it helps us understand etiology, or how a mental disorder is caused. And these include aspects of different theoretical models, as well as the different risk factors available to an individual that may or may not develop an issue with a mental disorder. Epidemiology is the prevalence of mental disorders. It talks about in the book cholera, and in this London town, you can see the different water wells that was observed. In looking at this particular well, you can see the dispersal of cholera. Now, it's not around this one, it's not around that one, so there must be something about this well that creates all the sickness. If only mental health were as easy to do that as well. So, looking at this, we have a variety of mental health disorders, and the seriousness of them, according to this, is serious, moderate, and mild. Any anxiety disorder, the rates, any mood disorder, any substance use disorder, any DSM-5, of course this is 4, but any DSM-5 disorder is really what we're focused on now. People with one disorder, people with co-occurring disorders, people with 3 or more disorders. So sometimes there's clusters of disorders. For instance, substance abuse can put people in situations where maybe they witness a crime or there's violence, and out of that situation they develop PTSD. So things like that. It's important to understand that some people just are prone to or have a predisposition towards mental health disorders in general, and so due to their genetics or other things, and when that happens, as different stressors happen, they might develop different mental health issues. So our prevalence rates. So in a person's lifetime, about 28% of the population, almost 29%, is going to have some type of anxiety-related disorder. And as we go on into the DSM-5 next week, we see that even though somebody might have all of the symptoms or enough of the symptoms to qualify for a disorder, sometimes they haven't had them long enough. So things like PTSD, there's a time requirement for those symptoms to be in place. There's a time requirement for depression. There's a time requirement for anxiety. If there's a bipolar disorder, then there's a time requirement for the manic and the depression states. And so bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 are distinguished by how long things occur. And so it's important to realize that, you know, on Tuesday when my dog was put to sleep, I spent all day crying and really missing him. And, and if we look just at that one day, I would probably qualify for a disorder. But because it was only a day and, and some periods after that day, but I don't qualify for a depression disorder. So keep that in mind. And if you look at, the lifetime prevalence of any disorder, nearly half the population qualifies for a disorder. Two or more disorders, a quarter of the population might have two or more disorders. And then when we get down to three or more disorders, 17%. So that's pretty prevalent. As we look at the 12 months, so within the last year, we can see that these are significantly smaller numbers, but at almost any given time, 14% to 3% of the population is going to have addiction. The age of onset, almost any anxiety disorder, the age of onset is around 11 years old. Any mood disorder, the age of onset tends to be in the 30s, the late 20s, early 30s. Any substance use disorder before the age of 20, and any DSM disorder by the age of 14. So looking at different cohorts and the prevalence, we can see 18 to 29-year-old. I wish they actually had a date to put these cohorts in context, but they don't. And so the older generation, if you notice, 60 to 71, is the least affected. But as we get more modern, we see that my generation, I'm assuming this is probably a little older, my generation has the highest rates in nearly every category. The younger generation right now, 18 to 29, other than has the lowest out of the modern generations. So it's interesting to look at these different relationships and cohort effects. And these are some of the things that we can work on figuring out, right? The 18 to 29-year-olds were all born post 9/11. And so looking at that information, or they were too young to remember 9/11 happening. So it kind of makes sense that the 18 to 29-year-olds, the 30 to 44-year-olds were the ones who were adolescents and maybe older while 9/11 was happening. And so theirs is slightly higher, while the 45 to 59-year-olds were the parents and the working force during 9/11. So it's kind of interesting to see how those things may have impacted mental health according to the cohort. Treatment costs, just mental disorder. Now it's really interesting because one of the things that our society has been trying to do is find parity. Doctors, physical body doctors, get paid a lot more than clinicians, mental health clinicians do. And yet, when you look at the prevalence that over the lifetime, half of the people who are alive are going to experience a mental health condition, there's a lot of prevalence, and we don't get paid the same. Look at mental health disorders compared to substance use, and these two often go together. But then we look at Alzheimer's and musculoskeletal, respiratory, all of these, and what causes the most is mental health and substance abuse, with all other causes of disability wrapped up into one here. So it's pretty interesting that we have often the least amount of money going into mental health, and yet it's the most prevalent disability and disorder that there are disorders that there are. Risk factors, things that contribute to it. Age, of course, is one of the highest rates of mental disorders are found in 18 to 29 and 30 to 44 groups from that previous one. Education, individuals who do not complete high school are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with a mental disorder than those who complete or go beyond high school, especially substance use disorders. And so, and think about it, I worked in the addiction field for 20 years, and one of the more common factors of addiction is that people started using before they graduated high school, and as a result have dropped out. So it's not that they didn't complete high school and then had a problem. They often had a problem while they were in high school. People who are unemployed are more likely to develop psychological problems than those who are unemployed. And think about what's happened in the last year with COVID-19. How many people became unemployed and then developed mental health issues from being cooped up in home, the stress of being with children all day who before were going to school. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. And men are more likely than women to be diagnosed with substance use abuse disorders and antisocial personality disorder. However, women are at a greater risk for developing mood and depressive disorders and anxiety disorders, and women are more likely than men to be diagnosed with more than one mental disorder at any point in time. And so gender is a factor. Marital status, again, marital disruption, separation, or divorce is associated with mental disorders in general and with anxiety, mood, and substance use disorders in particular. And so now, again, is it the chicken or the egg? Did the substance use cause the marital disruption, or was after the marital disruption part of the reason for the substance abuse? And it goes both ways, I believe. And likewise, if the onset of anxiety and mood disorders occurs at a younger age or at 30, then we have to be aware of how that might impact relationships such as marriage. Race and ethnicity, there are different results in general with some specific differences. For instance, growing up in an urban environment where there's a lot of violence and gang issues, we know that is a factor in the outcomes of anxiety and PTSD, etc. And since most of the people who live in those areas are people of color, then there is some disparity between Caucasian and people of color when it comes to those things. So that's race and ethnicity contribute to where a person lives as far as urban and suburban and rural. So it's just important to really consider everything within context. Suicide is one of them is a major issue, especially we've heard reports, of course, of since COVID-19 with the loss of jobs and other things, suicide is a big factor, or those things are big factors in suicide. And this, of course, is talking specifically about college students and suicide. I am a survivor of suicide. My sister died at 17 years old due to suicide, and until I got into recovery myself, that was an issue for me as well, because of our background and because of the violence and everything that we grew up in. So there's nothing to be afraid of or to stigmatize. If a person is feeling suicidal, by all means, reach out, and including any of you students who are watching this video, reach out and ask for help. There's no reason to just go and lose your life. So ask for help, and there are lots of people who are willing to help. Of course, there's the hotline, suicide hotline that's available, but reach out to, if you're on campus or if you're near a campus, um, reaching out when somebody needs it. And if you have a friend who is talking about suicide, do not dismiss it, but take it seriously. So those are risk factors and protective factors. There are individuals. So when an individual has a positive temperament, a positive outlook on life, they tend to do better. Above average intelligence is helpful. Social competence, so the ability to mingle and talk with other people, and spirituality or religion are also individual protective factors. Within the family, a smaller family structure helps provide connection sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. Supportive relationships with parents, so being able to talk to your parents openly or have conversations. Good sibling relationships, when everybody is getting along, it tends to be helpful as far as your ability to ask for help when you need it. Adequate monitoring and rule setting by parents. And, if you remember, if you've already taken uh, human development, then, the authoritative parent style is the best. It produces the most well-rounded children as they grow up, and that is when the parent does pay attention to what their children are doing and has um, good rules that are not necessarily rigid rules. So allowing for some flexibility, especially as children get older. So those are some key factors in the family. And then at the community or social level, commitment to the schools is an important factor. Um, and good schools, where teachers are supportive of the students, they observe and can see when children are doing well or not doing well, and they have the services available to those children. Availability of health and social services, and then social cohesion, how well the community works together. In communities where people are communicating and talking, those are much more effective than if you've lived next to your neighbor for 10 years and don't even know their name. So when something happens and there's to show resilience, you can see that when there's severe disruptions in normal functioning and they stay up at this level, then that becomes a chronic issue. Recovery is an individual is influenced by the event, and it might go up and down, but eventually comes down to lower levels of disruption. The delayed response is that everything seems to be normal, and then later on, the issue develops and it's a delayed response. And then resilience is the ability to kind of just roll with the punches and take things as they are. There might be some disruptions, but overall, the functioning of the individual stays fairly consistent. When we look at prevention strategies, the goal is to reduce the risk and enhance protective factors so that resilience can happen. And let's see. Table 3.3. I've got it here. I don't know why they didn't just show the table. Okay, so table 3.3 is on page 65 of your book, and it's a sample plan for preventing child maltreatment in high-risk families. And so I'm not going to go over it. Feel free to go over it. It's just a simple plan to deal with things such as positive parenting, learning how to enjoy the child, parenting skills, extended parenting, and anger management. And so following this simple plan will help prevent child abuse in high-risk families. It'll help, but it also depends on the willingness of the parents to make it happen. Looking at prevention on a continuum, we have, of course, prevention, which is universal measures. That's like teaching kids at school to be friends with their neighbor. And then we have selective, and those are the next level of prevention. So this is primary prevention. That's prevention for everybody. Selective prevention, right, is the secondary prevention. And so that is these person are at risk, and now we know that they have the risk factors for it, so we're trying to prevent it from going into the actual disorder. And then the indicated is they actually have the disorder, and now we're trying to prevent further harm from happening. And so those are the things that we're really looking at as far as prevention goes. And then we have the next level, which is treatment. So once they have the disorder, we're identifying it, and then we're using the standards of treatment for the known disorders. And ultimately, once they complete treatment, we want them to maintain it. And so we're looking at aftercare, rehab, and compliance with the treatment. So as they go on through this continuum, the best thing to do is obviously prevent it. So if we can prevent it from going any further up here, then that's what we want to do. Likewise, if it goes beyond prevention and we actually have to do treatment, then we want to make sure that they're staying within the realm of health. And so the book has some pretty good information on those type of prevention. Talks about prevention for eating disorders and mental disorders. So make sure that you read through your book. The reflections, of course, are what are the risk factors for mental disorders? Why is early prevention efforts so important? Because we want to prevent the disorder from even happening wherever possible. And sometimes it's like, to go back to the diathesis stress model, if we can reduce some stress, we might be able to prevent a disorder from actually coming about. So, which preventative approaches presented in this chapter do you find as an individual particularly effective? So keep all that in mind, and especially on campus, and there are lots of things that are available to reduce stress, going to the gym, etc., talking with family members, and even within the COVID situation that we're living in, there are opportunities to help you reduce stress and monitor that. So, anybody have any questions or about the material? All right. If there aren't any questions, thank you to the students who showed up for this. And remember, it's not mandatory. I do appreciate, though, at least having an audience to talk to, even if they haven't asked any questions yet. So thank you for spending your afternoon with me, and hope you all have a good week and a good weekend.